What you're about to hear isn't just another vampire story. This is about a man who discovered that running from darkness only leads you deeper into it, and sometimes the monsters we fear are the only ones who truly understand us. In 1840, when the world still believed in curses and bloodlines carried weight heavier than gold, Thomas Whitmore made a choice that would either save him or condemn him forever. But here's what nobody tells you about salvation. Sometimes it wears fangs, and sometimes the family you're born into matters far less than the family you choose in your darkest hour. Thomas Whitmore was 32 years old when he learned the truth about his father's crimes, and that discovery sent him running into the Carpathian wilderness with nothing but a leather satchel and the weight of inherited shame. His father, Lord Edmund Whitmore, hadn't just been a respected magistrate in London. He'd been a monster in gentleman's clothing, responsible for the execution of 43 innocent people, most of them women accused of witchcraft, all of them murdered for money and land. When the truth surfaced after Edmund's sudden death, Thomas found documents, ledgers, and letters that painted a portrait of systematic evil spanning 2 decades. The families of the victims wanted blood. They wanted the Whitmore line erased from existence. So Thomas did what any man would do when his father's sins became his inheritance. He vanished. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of running away. Thomas didn't just run from his past. He ran straight into something that should have killed him, but instead taught him what it truly means to be human. 3 months into his exile, starving and half-frozen in the Romanian mountains, Thomas stumbled upon a cabin that maps claimed didn't exist. Inside that cabin, in a coffin sealed with symbols he couldn't read, slept something that had been waiting for exactly someone like him. Her name was Ilara, and she'd been asleep for 173 years, hidden away by the last person who loved her before fear turned love into betrayal. What Thomas couldn't have known was that waking her would create a bond neither death nor time could sever, and that the ending of their story would break your heart in ways you won't see coming. This isn't about a monster and a victim. This is about 2 souls, both running from what they were, both finding in each other what they'd lost in themselves. And the twist? The real monster was never the one with fangs. The wind cut through Thomas Whitmore's coat like 1,000 frozen blades, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would die in these mountains. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. The Carpathian wilderness showed no mercy to men who arrived unprepared, and Thomas had arrived with nothing but desperation and 3 days' worth of stale bread. His boots, fine London leather meant for cobblestone streets, were falling apart against the rocky terrain. His hands were cracked and bleeding. His lips were split from the cold. And yet he kept walking because going back meant facing the rope or the mob. And Thomas Whitmore had decided that if death was coming for him, it would find him on his own terms. It had been 87 days since he'd fled London. 87 days since he'd opened his father's private study and found the ledger that destroyed everything he thought he knew about his family. Thomas had loved his father, respected him, mourned him properly when fever took him last spring. Lord Edmund Whitmore had been a magistrate, a man of law and order, a pillar of London society. Or so Thomas had believed until he found the locked drawer, the hidden papers, the meticulous records of bribes and falsified testimonies and innocent lives snuffed out for profit. 43 people, 43 souls condemned to death by hanging or burning, their properties seized, their families destroyed. Also, Edmund Whitmore could expand his wealth and influence. The worst part wasn't discovering his father was a murderer. The worst part was discovering he'd been good at it, systematic, efficient, almost proud based on the careful way he'd documented each case. Thomas had vomited in that study, then spent 3 days trying to decide what to do. Turn the evidence over to authorities? His father was already dead and beyond justice. Keep it hidden. The guilt would eat him alive. Before he could decide, the families had come. Someone else had found evidence. Someone else had talked. And suddenly, the Whitmore name was poison and Thomas was guilty by blood, so he'd run. First to Dover, then across the Channel to France, then east through Germany, and finally here, to the edge of the civilized world, where mountains touched clouds and villages were separated by days of travel instead of hours. He'd thought distance would bring peace. He'd thought if he ran far enough, he could outrun the shame, the guilt, the way people looked at him when they learned his name. But shame, Thomas discovered, travels lighter than luggage and follows closer than shadows. The snow had started 3 hours ago, light flurries that were rapidly becoming a proper storm. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and scanned the darkening forest for shelter. Night fell early this far north, and he'd learned the hard way that being caught outside after dark in these mountains invited more than just cold. Wolves hunted these woods, bears too, and if the villagers from the last settlement were to be believed, things worse than either. That's when he saw it. A break in the trees, a clearing he hadn't noticed before, and in the center of that clearing, a cabin. Not a ruin, not an abandoned hovel, but an actual structure with intact walls and a roof that looked sound. Thomas blinked, certain his frozen mind was creating mirages, but the cabin remained. Smoke should have been rising from its chimney. Footprints should have marked the snow around it. But there was nothing, just the cabin, standing alone, like it had been waiting. Every instinct Thomas possessed screamed at him to turn back, find another way, sleep in the forest if necessary. But the snow was falling harder now, and his body was shutting down from cold and exhaustion, and the cabin was right there. Shelter, walls, maybe even firewood. He staggered forward, his numb feet barely lifting with each step. The door was unlocked. That should have been the second warning, but Thomas was beyond heeding warnings. He pushed inside and nearly wept at the absence of wind. The interior was a single large room, surprisingly well preserved for an abandoned dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Simple furniture occupied the space, a table, 2 chairs, a cupboard. Everything was covered in dust but intact, as if the occupant had simply walked out one day and never returned. And in the corner, half hidden in shadow, was a large wooden chest that looked more like a coffin than storage. Thomas closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. His fingers were too numb to feel, and his face burned with the peculiar pain of flesh warming too quickly. He needed fire. He needed food. He needed to rest before his body simply gave up. He stumbled to the fireplace and found miraculously a stack of wood beside it that had somehow remained dry. Even more miraculous, there were flint and steel on the mantel. Within minutes, Thomas had a fire burning, and the warmth felt like salvation. As the cabin warmed and Thomas's body began to thaw, he took stock of his surroundings more carefully. The furniture was old, but quality, the kind wealthy families owned. The cupboard held nothing but dust. The table had strange marks carved into its surface, symbols Thomas didn't recognize. And that chest in the corner kept drawing his attention, because now that his eyes had adjusted to the firelight, he could see that it wasn't a chest at all. It was definitely a coffin, and there were chains wrapped around it, sealed with a lock that looked ancient. No one puts chains on a coffin unless they're trying to keep something in, or someone. Thomas knew he should leave it alone. He knew that whatever was in there, it was sealed for a reason. But 3 months of running, 3 months of solitude and guilt and shame had done something to his judgment. Or maybe it was simply that a man who's already lost everything has nothing left to fear. Thomas approached the coffin slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The chains were old, crusted with rust, but the lock was solid. Thomas searched the cabin and found nothing resembling a key. He returned to the fireplace, selected a heavy piece of firewood, and used it to smash the lock. It took 6 strikes before the lock shattered, and when it did, the chains fell away with a sound like sighing. Thomas set down his makeshift weapon and placed both hands on the coffin lid. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been, but he managed to push it open. Inside lay a woman, and she was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. That was his first thought, followed immediately by confusion, because dead things aren't supposed to look like this. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the firelight, dark hair that spilled across white silk like ink on snow, and features so perfect they seemed carved by an artist's hand. She wore a dress from another era, deep red velvet with black lace, and her hands were folded across her chest like a saint in repose. But the most striking thing about her was that she looked alive. Not dead, not even sleeping. Alive, as if she might open her eyes at any moment. Thomas reached out to touch her hand and jerked back immediately. She was cold, yes, but not corpse cold. More like the cold of stone that's been kept from sunlight. And her skin had given slightly under his touch, not the rigid stiffness of death. He leaned closer, studying her face, and that's when he saw her chest rise and fall with the barest whisper of breath. She was breathing, barely, almost imperceptibly, but breathing. This woman, in a chained coffin in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere, was alive. Thomas stumbled backward, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she here? Who had chained her coffin? And why did she appear to be sleeping rather than dead? He should run. He should leave this cabin and never look back. But something held him there, rooted to the spot, staring at this impossible woman who breathed without waking. The fire crackled behind him. Snow beat against the windows. And Thomas Whitmore, running from his family's past, made the second worst decision of his life. The first had been opening his father's ledger. The second was reaching out and gently shaking the sleeping woman's shoulder, trying to wake her up. Because that's what decent men do, right? They don't leave mysterious women locked in coffins. They try to help. They try to understand. Thomas would realize later, much later, that some mercies are cruelties in disguise, and that waking someone from 173 years of sleep is the kind of help that destroys as much as it saves. Her eyes opened. They were golden, not brown, not hazel, but pure liquid gold, and they fixed on Thomas with an intensity that pinned him in place like a butterfly on a collector's board. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She simply stared at him with those impossible eyes, while Thomas's heart hammered in his chest and every instinct screamed at him to run. But he couldn't move. Those eyes held him, and in them he saw something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. The woman in the coffin sat up slowly, gracefully, her movements fluid in a way that living bodies shouldn't move. And then she smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp, canines that were just slightly too long. Thomas Whitmore had found his cabin. He'd found his shelter from the storm, but what he'd actually found was a sleeping vampire. And she'd been waiting for someone exactly like him. The vampire spoke first, and her voice was like music played on instruments that no longer existed, melodic and strange and utterly mesmerizing. "You freed me," she said, and though her lips moved to form English words, there was an accent underneath that Thomas couldn't place, something older than any language he knew. "After all this time, someone finally freed me." She rose from the coffin with impossible grace, her feet touching the floor without a sound, and Thomas finally found the ability to move. He scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his breath coming in short gasps, his mind unable to process what his eyes were showing him. The woman tilted her head, studying him with those golden eyes, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face. Not hunger, as he'd expected, but curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like sadness. "Please, don't be afraid," she said, taking a step toward him. Thomas pressed harder against the wall, and she stopped immediately, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "I know what you're thinking. I know what you see when you look at me. But I give you my word, on whatever honor I have left, that I will not harm you. You freed me from that prison, and for that I owe you a debt that transcends hunger." Her words were formal, archaic, the way people spoke in old books Thomas had read as a child. She noticed his confusion and smiled sadly. "Forgive me. I've been asleep for a very long time. The world has moved on without me, hasn't it? What year is this?" Thomas's mouth was dry, his tongue thick with fear, but he managed to force out words. 1840, October, late October. The vampire's eyes widened, and she swayed slightly, reaching out to grip the edge of the coffin for support. 173 years, she whispered. I've been sleeping for 173 years. Everyone I knew is dead. Everyone I loved is dust and memory. The world I left behind is gone. She looked at Thomas, then really looked at him, and he saw tears forming in those golden eyes. What's your name? Thomas, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas Whitmore. She nodded slowly, processing this information. And then she moved to one of the chairs by the table, sitting down with careful, deliberate movements, as if testing whether her body still remembered how. My name is Ilara, she said. Ilara Dukovny. I was born in 1641, in what was then called Wallachia, though I suspect that name means nothing to you now. I was turned in 1667 by a vampire, whose name I will not speak, and I lived as one of the night children for exactly 100 years before the person I loved most in this world decided I was too dangerous to exist and put me in that coffin with chains and locks and sleeping draughts that would keep me unconscious until someone broke the seal. She looked at her hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. I never thought anyone would. I thought I would sleep forever, trapped in darkness, conscious enough to know I was trapped but unable to wake or die. That was my punishment for the crime of loving someone who feared what I was more than they loved who I was. Thomas found himself sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his legs unable to hold him any longer. This was impossible. Vampires were stories, legends, things that didn't exist in the real world. But here she was, sitting at a table in an abandoned cabin, tears running down her pale cheeks, telling him about a life that spanned centuries. You're really a vampire, he said, and it wasn't a question. Ilara nodded. I am, but not the kind you've heard about in stories, I suspect. We don't turn into bats or wolves. We don't sleep in earth from our homeland. We don't fear crosses or running water or any of the superstitious nonsense that humans invented to make themselves feel safer. What we are is simple and terrible. We're humans who stopped aging, stopped dying, and started needing blood to survive. That's all. No magic, no demonic possession, just a disease that changed everything about how our bodies work. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow. I can hear your heartbeat from here, she said softly. I can smell your blood, warm and sweet and alive. I can feel the heat radiating from your body, and every instinct I have is screaming at me to feed, because I haven't eaten in 173 years, and the hunger is like knives in my throat. But I won't. I gave you my word, and despite what I am, I keep my promises. She turned to face him, and Thomas saw the effort it was costing her to maintain control. Her hands were trembling. Her jaw was clenched so tight he could see muscles jumping beneath her skin. You should leave, she said. Take whatever supplies you need and go. Don't tell anyone about this place or about me. Just go and forget you ever opened that coffin. Thomas should have run. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to take her advice and flee into the storm. But something kept him rooted in place, something more than fear, something that felt almost like recognition. He looked at this woman, this creature, this impossible thing standing by the window fighting her own nature to keep him safe. And he saw something familiar in her eyes. Pain, guilt, the weight of things done and things left undone. She was running from her past just like he was, except her past was measured in centuries instead of months, and her chains had been literal instead of metaphorical. I can't leave, Thomas heard himself say. There's a storm outside, and I barely made it here alive. If I go back out there now, I'll freeze to death before I make it half a mile. Ilara closed her eyes, and a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob escaped her throat. Then we're both trapped, she said. You by the storm, me by hunger. What a pair we make. She returned to the table and sat down heavily, her earlier grace abandoning her. Tell me, Thomas Whitmore, what brings a man to the Carpathian wilderness in late October? You're not a hunter. Your clothes, despite their current state, are too fine. You're not a trader. You carry nothing of value. And you're not a wanderer. Everything about you screams civilization and comfort. So what are you running from? The question cut deeper than Thomas expected, and he found himself answering before he could think better of it. My family, he said. My father, specifically. He died 6 months ago, and I thought I knew him. I thought he was a good man, a just man. But after his death, I found evidence that he was a murderer. He sent 43 innocent people to their deaths for money and property. 43 lives destroyed, and I'm his son, his only heir. When the truth came out, the families of the victims wanted revenge, and I couldn't blame them. So I ran. I've been running for 3 months, trying to get far enough away that the Whitmore name means nothing, that I can start over without my father's crimes defining who I am. Ilara was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul.
You carry guilt that isn't yours, she finally said.
Your father's sins are his own. You didn't kill those people. You didn't take their property or destroy their families. Why should you pay for his crimes? Thomas laughed bitterly. Because I'm his son. Because his blood runs in my veins. Because maybe whatever darkness drove him to do those things is in me too, just waiting to surface. How do I know I'm any better than he was? How can anyone trust me when they learn where I come from? By your actions, Ilara said simply. Not by your bloodline, not by your father's choices, by what you choose to do when faced with darkness. Your father chose to embrace it. You chose to run from it. That difference matters. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Listen to me, Thomas Whitmore. I've lived for 207 years. I have seen empires rise and fall. I've watched generations of humans make the same mistakes over and over, and I've learned one truth that transcends all others. You are not your father. You are not your family. You are not your blood. You are the sum of your choices, nothing more and nothing less. And the fact that you ran, instead of hiding behind your family name and wealth, tells me more about who you are than any lineage ever could. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd been building for 3 months, suddenly developing fissures. You don't know me, he said, but his voice broke on the words. You don't know what I'm capable of. Ilara smiled sadly. No, but I know what I'm capable of, and I know the difference between someone who fights their darkness and someone who surrenders to it. You freed me from that coffin, Thomas. You could have left me there. You could have walked away. But you opened the chains and woke me up, even though you had no idea what you'd find. That speaks to who you are in ways that your father's ledger never could. The fire crackled behind them, and outside the storm intensified, wind howling through the trees like tortured souls. Thomas pulled himself to his feet and moved to sit in the chair across from Ilara. Up close, he could see the tiny details that marked her as something other than human. The way her skin seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, the complete absence of imperfections or blemishes, the slight elongation of her canines even when she wasn't smiling. But he could also see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she held herself with rigid control, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed how much effort it was taking her not to attack him. When did you last feed? He asked. Ilara's eyes widened slightly at the question. 173 years ago, she said. The night before they put me in the coffin. Why do you ask? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing he was about to make either the bravest or stupidest decision of his life. Because you saved me, he said. Whether you realize it or not, you saved me. I was dying out there in the cold, and I found this cabin, and now I'm alive and warm. And you're sitting here starving because you gave me your word you wouldn't hurt me. That's not the action of a monster. That's the action of someone fighting to hold on to their humanity despite everything. He rolled up his sleeve, exposing his forearm. Take what you need. Not all of it, obviously, but enough that you're not in danger of losing control. I'm offering Ilara. I'm choosing this. The vampire stared at his exposed arm like it was both salvation and damnation. You don't know what you're offering, she whispered. Once I taste your blood, I'll know you. Your memories, your emotions, your deepest fears and greatest hopes. Vampire feeding isn't just physical. It's intimate in ways that humans can't comprehend. And there's a risk. If I take too much, if I lose control even for a moment, you'll die. Or worse, you'll become like me. Are you truly willing to take that chance? Thomas met her eyes and saw his own desperation reflected back at him. Two broken souls, two refugees from their own pasts, trapped together in a cabin while a storm raged outside. What did he have to lose? His life was already forfeit. The moment he ran from London, he'd accepted that he would probably die alone and forgotten. At least this way, his death might serve a purpose. At least this way, he wouldn't be alone at the end. I'm willing, he said quietly. I trust you, Ilara Dukovny. I don't know why, but I do. Ilara stood slowly and moved around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. She knelt down so they were at eye level, and Thomas saw tears streaming down her face. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish, she said. But I thank you for your trust, for your kindness, for seeing me as something more than a monster. She took his arm gently, her cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, and lowered her head. Thomas felt the sharp sting of her fangs piercing his skin, and then everything changed. The pain lasted only a second before it transformed into something else entirely, something he had no words for. It was like falling and flying simultaneously, like every nerve in his body was suddenly alive and singing. But more than the physical sensation was the mental connection, the sudden awareness that Ilara wasn't just feeding on his blood, but experiencing his life. He felt her in his mind, felt her seeing his memories, his childhood in London, his mother's death when he was 12, his father's stern but loving presence, the day he discovered the ledger, the night he fled. And through that connection, he felt her memories too. Fragments and flashes of a life that spanned centuries, a village burning, a man she loved turning away from her in fear, the suffocating darkness of the coffin, the endless nightmare of conscious sleep. When Ilara finally pulled away, they were both shaking. She pressed her hand against the wound on his arm, and Thomas felt the bleeding stop immediately, felt his skin knitting back together with supernatural speed. Your blood tastes like sorrow, she said softly, wiping her mouth with trembling fingers. And guilt, and loneliness. Oh, Thomas, you've been so alone. He laughed weakly, feeling suddenly exhausted. So have you, he said. I felt it. I felt what they did to you, the man who put you in that coffin. He loved you, didn't he? Ilara nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. His name was Mikhail, and yes, he loved me. But love and fear are not mutually exclusive, and eventually his fear grew stronger than his love. He convinced himself that I was too dangerous to exist, that my nature would eventually overcome my control, that I would kill someone innocent. So he drugged my wine one night with something that put me to sleep, and when I woke, I was in that coffin, and he was sealing the chains. The last thing I heard before the sleeping draught pulled me under completely was him saying he was sorry, that this was for my own good, that maybe in 100 years the world would be ready for someone like me. She laughed bitterly, no. And here we are, 173 years later, and I doubt the world is any more ready than it was then. Thomas reached out instinctively and took her hand. It was cold, but not unpleasantly so. And when she squeezed back, he felt the supernatural strength she was carefully restraining. Maybe the world will never be ready, he said. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve to exist in it. You're not a monster, Ilara. Monsters don't cry. Monsters don't honor their promises. Monsters don't fight their nature to protect strangers. They sat like that for a long moment, two broken people holding hands in an abandoned cabin, while snow piled against the windows and the fire burned low. Finally, Ilara spoke again. You should rest, she said. You're exhausted, and the feeding has weakened you. Sleep, Thomas. I'll keep watch and make sure the fire doesn't go out. You're safe here. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to say he couldn't possibly sleep knowing there was a vampire watching him, but his body had other ideas. The exhaustion hit him like a physical weight, and before he could protest, his eyes were closing. The last thing he felt was Ilara helping him to the floor near the fire, covering him with his own coat, her cold hand brushing hair back from his forehead with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you for freeing me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for not seeing a monster when you looked at me. I will protect you, Thomas Whitmore. I swear it on whatever remains of my soul." Thomas drifted into sleep with those words echoing in his mind, and for the first time in 3 months, he felt something that might have been peace. He was still running from his past. He was still carrying guilt that wasn't his. But now, at least, he wasn't running alone. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside the cabin, a vampire kept her vigil by the fire, watching over the first person in 173 years who had looked at her and seen something worth saving. Neither of them knew yet that their meeting wasn't coincidence. Neither of them understood that the cabin, the coffin, and their broken pasts were all connected by threads that stretched back through decades of pain and betrayal. But they would learn, and when they did, the choice they'd have to make would either save them both or destroy them completely. Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and the peculiar sensation of being watched. He opened his eyes to find morning light streaming through the cabin windows, and Ilara sitting at the table, her golden eyes fixed on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You snore," she said when she noticed he was awake, and there was something almost like amusement in her voice. "Not loudly, but consistently. It's oddly comforting. I'd forgotten what it sounds like to have another living being nearby." Thomas sat up slowly, his body aching in ways that reminded him of the previous day's journey and the night's bizarre events. The wound on his arm was completely healed, not even a scar remaining to mark where Ilara's fangs had pierced his skin. He looked at the vampire, really looked at her in proper daylight, and was struck again by how human she appeared. If not for the golden eyes and the preternatural stillness with which she sat, he might have mistaken her for a beautiful woman rather than something that had existed for over 2 centuries. "You made coffee," he said stupidly, and Ilara smiled. "I did. Well, I attempted to. I'm not certain I remembered the process correctly, and your supplies were limited, but it should be drinkable. There's also bread, though it's rather stale." She gestured to the table where a steaming cup and a small piece of bread waited. Thomas stood, his joints protesting, and made his way to the chair. The coffee was bitter and too strong, but it was warm and caffeinated, and at that moment it tasted like the finest thing he'd ever consumed. He ate the bread slowly, aware that it was likely the last food he had, and tried to process the impossible reality that he was having breakfast with a vampire. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Ilara shook her head. "I don't sleep the way you do. Not anymore. I can enter a state of rest if I choose, something between sleeping and waking, but it's not necessary. Last night I kept the fire burning and watched the storm pass. It was beautiful in its way. Terrifying and destructive, yes, but beautiful. I'd forgotten how much I missed seeing the world change, even in small ways like weather patterns." She paused, then continued more quietly. "I also spent the night thinking about what happens next. For both of us." Thomas set down his coffee cup, his appetite suddenly gone. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we both face impossible choices now," Ilara said. "You freed me, Thomas, and I'm grateful beyond words. But I'm also realistic. I'm a vampire. I need blood to survive. Your generosity last night sustained me, but I'll need to feed again and regularly. I can hunt animals, and I will. But animal blood is like eating nothing but bread when your body craves meat. It sustains, but it doesn't nourish. Eventually I'll need human blood again, which means I'll need to either leave this place and find victims, or I'll need to find willing donors, or I'll need to learn to survive on less than what my body demands. None of those options are good." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "And then there's the matter of my imprisonment. Mikhail didn't put me in that coffin without reason. He feared what I might do, and he wasn't entirely wrong to fear. I've killed, Thomas. In my 200 years, I've taken lives. Not as many as some of my kind, and always I tried to choose people who deserved death, murderers, rapists, men who hurt others for pleasure. But I still killed them. I still drank until their hearts stopped beating. I still chose to be judge, jury, and executioner, which makes me no better than your father in his magistrate's robes, condemning innocence for profit." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Are you saying I made a mistake freeing you?" Ilara's expression softened. "No, I'm saying that freedom comes with responsibility, and I need to decide what kind of creature I want to be now that I'm no longer imprisoned. I have a choice. I can return to my old ways, hunting and feeding and living in the shadows. Or I can try to be something different, something better. But I can't make that choice alone. I need help. I need guidance. I need someone to remind me what it means to be human, when every instinct I have screams that I'm not." She reached across the table and took his hand, her cold fingers intertwining with his warm ones. "I know it's insane. I know you have no reason to trust me or help me. I know you have your own problems and your own past to escape. But I'm asking anyway, Thomas Whitmore, stay with me. Help me learn to be something more than a monster. In return, I'll protect you. I'll help you escape whatever hunters might be following you from London. I'll be your companion in this exile, your friend in this wilderness. We're both running from our pasts. Maybe we can run together, at least for a while. Maybe we can help each other become something better than what we were born into." Thomas stared at their joined hands, at the contrast between his warm, scarred skin and her cold, perfect flesh. Everything rational in his mind told him this was madness. Vampires were creatures of legend and nightmare. Even if she meant every word she said, even if she genuinely wanted to be better, her nature would eventually win. She would kill again. She would hurt someone, and if he stayed with her, he would be complicit in whatever she did. But then he remembered the guilt in her eyes when she told him about her past. He remembered the way she'd fought her hunger to keep her promise not to harm him. He remembered the gentleness with which she'd cared for him while he slept. And he thought about his own isolation, his own loneliness, his own desperate need for connection after 3 months of running alone. "I'll stay," he heard himself say. "Not forever, maybe, but for now. We'll figure this out together." Ilara's face transformed, and Thomas realized it was the first time he'd seen her truly smile. It lit up her features, made her look young and hopeful and almost human. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you. Thomas, I promise you won't regret this. I promise I'll earn your trust every day. I'll be worthy of this second chance you're giving me." She stood abruptly, releasing his hand, and began pacing the cabin with sudden energy. "We'll need supplies. Food for you, since you can't survive on blood and good intentions. We'll need warmer clothes for winter. We'll need to make this cabin properly habitable, not just a temporary shelter. And we'll need to establish rules, boundaries, ways to coexist that keep both of us safe." Over the next hours, they talked through the practical realities of their strange partnership. Thomas would hunt and gather what food he could before winter made it impossible. Ilara would hunt animals for blood and would only feed from Thomas in emergencies. They would share the cabin, but Thomas would have privacy when he needed it. Ilara would teach Thomas about her kind, their strengths and weaknesses, so he would know how to protect himself if necessary. Thomas would help Ilara relearn the world, catch up on 173 years of missed history, and navigate a society that had changed beyond recognition during her sleep. But what started as practical planning soon became something deeper. They began sharing stories, trading histories, revealing pieces of themselves they'd never shown anyone else. Thomas told her about his childhood, about a mother who died too young, and a father who became colder and more distant with each passing year. He told her about the loneliness of being an only child in a large house, about servants who were kind but ultimately just employees, about friends who disappeared when the Whitmore name became tainted. And Ilara told him about her life before and after becoming a vampire, about growing up in a Wallachian village during a time of war and plague, about being turned at 26 by a vampire who had wanted a companion and had chosen her because she'd been dying of fever and had nothing to lose. He asked my permission. Ilara said quietly as they sat by the fire that evening. Nikolai, the vampire who turned me, he found me in my family's cottage, burning with fever, hours from death. Everyone else had fled the plague, but I had nowhere to go. He sat with me and explained what he was, what he could offer. Eternal life, he said. Freedom from death and disease. The chance to see centuries pass, to witness history unfold. But also eternal hunger, eternal darkness, eternal separation from humanity. He gave me the choice, and I chose life, even a cursed life over death. For many years I was grateful. Then I met Mikhail, and for the first time since my turning, I wished I had chosen differently. Thomas heard the pain in her voice and shifted closer until their shoulders were touching. "Tell me about him," he said softly. "Tell me about the man who put you in that coffin." Ilara was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer, but finally she spoke. Mikhail was a scholar, a historian. He collected old manuscripts and studied ancient civilizations. We met in 1752 in Prague, at a gathering of intellectuals and artists. I was pretending to be a wealthy widow, and he was presenting research on Byzantine texts. We talked all night about history and philosophy and what it means to be human. When dawn approached and I had to leave, he asked if he could see me again. I said yes, even though I knew it was dangerous. She pulled her knees to her chest, a surprisingly vulnerable gesture that made her look young despite her centuries. We courted for 6 months before I told him what I was. I thought he would run, thought he would hate me. Instead, he was fascinated. He saw me as a living link to the past, a primary source for all his historical research. He said he loved me, and I believed him. For 15 years we were together. He would write during the day while I slept. I would share my memories with him at night, telling him about the centuries I'd witnessed. We were happy, or I thought we were. Then came the night when he drugged my wine and put me in that coffin, and I realized that his fascination had curdled into fear, and his love had never been strong enough to overcome that fear. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. He had no right, he said. No matter what his reasons, no matter how afraid he was, he had no right to imprison you like that. Ilara smiled sadly and touched his cheek, her cold fingers gentle against his skin. You're angry on my behalf. That's sweet. But Mikhail wasn't entirely wrong to fear me. I told you I've killed Thomas. I've taken lives. Not innocents, never innocents, but lives nonetheless. And there were times when the hunger was so strong that I came close to losing control, close to hurting people who didn't deserve it. Mikhail saw those moments. He saw me struggle. And eventually, his fear of what I might do outweighed his love for who I was. But you never actually hurt an innocent, Thomas insisted. You fought your nature. You controlled yourself. That should have mattered more than his fear. Ilara shook her head. Should have, but didn't. Fear is more powerful than logic, Thomas. Surely you understand that. It's fear that drove you from London. Fear of what people would do to you because of your father's crimes. Fear that maybe you carried his darkness inside you. Fear can make monsters of anyone, whether they have fangs or not. They fell silent, both lost in their own thoughts, and Thomas realized that somewhere in the past 2 days, something fundamental had shifted. He no longer saw Ilara as a vampire first and a person second. He saw her as someone who was hurt and lonely, and trying desperately to be better than her circumstances, which was exactly what he was trying to do. They were kindred spirits, he and this creature of legend, both marked by others' sins, both running from past they couldn't change, both hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could find something like redemption in each other's company. The days that followed fell into a strange but comfortable rhythm. Thomas would wake with the sun and spend his days gathering what supplies he could. Firewood, pine nuts, the last autumn berries, and occasionally a rabbit or bird he managed to trap. Ilara would rest during the brightest hours. That strange, not quite sleep she described, and would wake as dusk approached. Together they would share a meal, Thomas eating his meager food while Ilara watched with something that looked like nostalgia. Then they would talk, sometimes until dawn broke again, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Thomas taught Ilara about the world she'd missed, the French Revolution, the rise of industry, the new ideas about democracy and human rights. Ilara taught Thomas about her world, the old ways of thinking, the centuries of history she'd witnessed, the strange reality of watching empires rise and crumble while you remained unchanging. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. The times when they would simply sit together by the fire, not speaking, just existing in each other's presence. Thomas found that her cold stillness became comforting rather than unsettling. Ilara found that his warm, breathing life reminded her of everything she'd lost, but also everything worth preserving. They were healing each other, slowly, carefully, one shared moment at a time. 3 weeks into their strange cohabitation, Thomas woke in the middle of the night to find Ilara sitting by the window, tears streaming down her face. He went to her immediately, no longer afraid, and she turned to him with such raw pain in her eyes that his heart broke. "I killed a deer tonight," she whispered. "I was hunting, and I found a doe separated from her herd. I fed from her, and I tried to stop before she died. I truly did. But the hunger was so strong, and she was so warm, and I couldn't stop. I killed her, Thomas. I drained her completely, and I felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, just satisfaction. What kind of monster have I become?" Thomas pulled her into his arms, ignoring the supernatural cold of her body, and held her while she sobbed. "You're not a monster," he said firmly. "You're a predator. There's a difference. A lion doesn't feel guilt when it kills a gazelle. A hawk doesn't mourn the rabbit. You need blood to survive, Ilara. Taking it from animals instead of humans is already more than most of your kind would do. You can't hate yourself for your nature." She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back with strength that could have crushed him if she'd wanted. "But I should feel something," she said. "I should feel remorse or sadness or anything. The fact that I don't means Mikhail was right. I am too dangerous. I'm losing my humanity bit by bit, and eventually there will be nothing left but hunger and death." Thomas pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "You're crying," he pointed out. "You're upset that you don't feel guilty, which means you still have a conscience. Monsters don't cry over dead deer, Ilara. They don't worry about losing their humanity. The fact that you're afraid of becoming a monster is proof that you're not one." He wiped tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, and she leaned into his touch like a starving person leaning into warmth. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of fighting this. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just surrender, to be the creature everyone expects me to be. But you won't," Thomas said with absolute certainty. "Because if you were going to surrender, you would have done it already. You would have killed me that first night instead of honoring your promise. You would have stopped caring about deer and guilt and humanity. But you didn't. You're still fighting, Ilara. You're still trying. And as long as you're trying, I'll be here to remind you why it matters." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, and Thomas realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with her. Not despite what she was, but because of it. Because she was broken and beautiful, and trying so desperately to be good in a world that had taught her she was evil. Because she saw him, really saw him, not as Lord Whitmore's son, but as Thomas. Just Thomas, a man trying to outrun his father's sins. Because in her golden eyes, he found acceptance he'd never felt anywhere else. He didn't tell her, not yet, but he held her tighter, and made a silent promise that he would help her fight her darkness for as long as she needed him, even if it took the rest of his life. Outside, winter was coming to the Carpathian Mountains. Inside the cabin, 2 lost souls had found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed: each other. And though they didn't know it yet, their story was about to take a turn that would test everything they'd built together. Because the past, as both of them knew too well, never stays buried forever. The knock on the cabin door came on the first day of December, and it changed everything. Thomas was mending one of his shirts by the fire when the sound echoed through the small space. 3 sharp raps that seemed impossibly loud in their quiet sanctuary. He froze, needle halfway through fabric, and met Ilara's eyes across the room. She'd gone completely still, that predatory stillness that marked her as something inhuman, and her hand moved instinctively to grip the back of her chair. "Someone's here," Thomas said unnecessarily, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Ilara replied, and he could hear the tension in her tone. "I can hear their heartbeat. One person, male, middle-aged, based on the rhythm, human." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Hello," called a voice from outside, speaking English, but with a thick accent Thomas couldn't place. "I mean no harm. I seek shelter from the cold, and perhaps information. Please, I know someone is inside. I saw smoke from your chimney." Thomas looked at Ilara, silently asking what they should do. She nodded slowly, then moved to position herself in the corner where she wouldn't be immediately visible when the door opened. Thomas took a deep breath, set down his mending, and crossed to the door. He opened it to find a man standing in the snow, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes set in a weathered face. He wore a heavy coat and carried a pack that suggested he'd been traveling for some time. When he saw Thomas, he smiled with obvious relief. "Thank God," the man said. "I've been walking for 2 days and was beginning to fear I would freeze before finding shelter. My name is Father Dimitri. I'm a priest from the village of Vadu, 3 days south of here. May I come in? I promise I won't impose long, just long enough to warm myself and perhaps share a meal if you can spare it." Every instinct Thomas had screamed warning. A priest! Of all the people who could have stumbled upon their cabin, it had to be a priest. He opened his mouth to make an excuse, to turn the man away, but Father Dimitri was already looking past him into the cabin, and Thomas saw the exact moment when the priest's eyes found Ilara standing in her corner. The color drained from Father Dimitri's face. His smile vanished. His hand moved to clutch at a cross hanging around his neck, and Thomas knew with sinking certainty that their sanctuary was about to crumble. "You, Father Dimitri breathed, staring at Ilara. "You're her. You're Ilara Dukhovny. But that's impossible. You should be dead. You should be dust and bones, unless—" His eyes widened further. "The coffin." Someone opened the coffin. After all these years, someone finally broke the seal. Ilara stepped forward into the light, and Thomas saw resignation on her face. "Hello, Dimitri," she said quietly. "You've aged well. The years have been kind to you." Father Dimitri staggered backward, nearly falling off the doorstep, and Thomas caught his arm instinctively. "You know him?" Thomas asked Ilara. She nodded slowly. "He was 16 when I last saw him. An orphan who worked in Mikhail's household. He helped Mikhail put me in that coffin, held the lantern while Mikhail sealed the chains. I remember you, Dimitri. You were crying. You kept saying you were sorry, that you didn't want to do it, but Mikhail insisted." The priest seemed to be in shock, his eyes moving between Ilara and Thomas as if trying to understand what he was seeing. "You should be dead," he repeated. "Mikhail swore that no one would ever find that cabin. He swore you would sleep forever, that the world would be safe from you. How are you free? Who broke the chains?" Thomas felt Ilara's eyes on him and knew what she was asking silently. Should we tell the truth? But before he could decide, Father Dimitri turned his full attention to Thomas, and understanding dawned in his weathered features. "You," the priest said. "You freed her. You opened the coffin." It wasn't a question. Thomas straightened his shoulders and met the priest's gaze without flinching. "I did. I didn't know what I would find. I was seeking shelter from a storm, and I found a coffin with chains. I thought someone might be trapped inside, so I broke the lock. I'd make the same choice again." Father Dimitri stared at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. It was a tired, sad sound, but genuine. "Of course you would. That's exactly the kind of noble foolishness Mikhail worried about. He said someone would eventually find the cabin and free her out of misplaced compassion. He said it would likely be some poor soul running from something, someone who saw the chains as cruelty rather than necessity. And here you are, fulfilling his prophecy decades after his death." The priest pushed past Thomas into the cabin, his earlier fear seeming to evaporate, replaced by a weary resignation. He looked around the space, his eyes lingering on the empty coffin in the corner, then turned back to Ilara. Tell me true, Ilara Dukovny. Have you killed since your awakening? Ilara met his gaze steadily. I've killed deer and rabbits for sustenance. I've not harmed a human soul, though the hunger has been difficult. Thomas has helped me. He's given me his blood when the need was greatest. And he's reminded me daily why I should fight to preserve what humanity I have left. Father Dimitri's eyes moved to Thomas again, and Thomas saw something that looked like pity in their depths. You gave her your blood willingly? Thomas nodded. She was starving. She'd been asleep for 173 years without feeding. She could have killed me that first night, but she didn't. She honored her promise not to harm me. How could I not help her? The priest sighed and moved to sit at the table, setting down his pack with the air of a man who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. You don't understand what you've done, he said quietly. You don't know the full story. Mikhail didn't imprison Ilara just because she was a vampire. He imprisoned her because she was bound to someone, tied by blood and ancient magic to another creature who used her as a weapon. And that creature has been searching for her for 173 years. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. Thomas looked at Ilara and saw shock and horror warring on her face. No, she whispered. Nikolai is dead. He died in 1752, killed by vampire hunters in Vienna. Mikhail told me. He said Nikolai's death freed me from the bond. Father Dmitri shook his head slowly. Mikhail lied. He lied to keep you compliant while he prepared your prison. Nikolai didn't die, Ilara. He survived the attack in Vienna and has spent the past 173 years hunting for you. The bond you share, the one forged when he turned you, it works both ways. He can sense when you're awake and active. And the moment you woke, the moment your consciousness returned, he felt it. He's been coming north for weeks now, following that connection like a bloodhound, following a scent. He'll be here soon, perhaps within days, and when he arrives, he'll either take you back or kill everyone in his path trying. Thomas felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet.
What bond?
He demanded. What are you talking about? Ilara sank into the other chair, her face ashen. When a vampire turns a human, she said quietly, a connection is formed. Most of the time it's weak, barely noticeable. But Nikolai is old, ancient even by vampire standards, and when he turned me, he made the bond deliberately strong. He wanted to always know where I was, to always be able to call me to him if needed. For years, I thought it was love. I thought his possessiveness was protection. By the time I realized he saw me as property rather than a person, it was too late. The bond can't be broken except by death, either his or mine. She looked at Thomas, with tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was alive. I thought I was free. I thought I could finally choose my own path. But if he's coming here, if he's found me after all this time, then everyone in this cabin is in danger. Nikolai doesn't share. He doesn't compromise. If he sees that I've formed a connection with you, if he senses what we've built here, he'll kill you without hesitation. Thomas felt fear coil in his stomach, but he pushed it down and reached across the table to take Ilara's hand. Then we run. We leave now, tonight, and we go somewhere he can't follow. Father Dmitri made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You can't run from a bond like theirs. Nikolai will follow Ilara to the ends of the earth. Distance means nothing to a vampire who has lived for centuries. Your only hope is to fight, but even that is likely futile. Nikolai is powerful beyond imagining. He survived wars, plagues, and countless attempts on his life. What chance do a young vampire and a human have against him? Then we'll find a way to break the bond, Thomas said firmly. There has to be a way. Magic that creates can be undone. Father Dmitri leaned forward, his expression intense. There is one way, one possibility, though it comes at a terrible cost. The bond can be broken if Ilara willingly gives up her vampiric nature. There's an ancient ritual, older than Christianity, that can reverse the transformation. It would make her human again, mortal and aging. But the process is excruciating, and the cost is steep. It requires the voluntary sacrifice of another vampire's essence, their entire being, to fuel the transformation. Essentially, one vampire must die to make another human. Ilara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. No, absolutely not. I won't buy my freedom with someone else's life. I won't become the monster I've spent decades trying not to be. Thomas stood too, moving to her side. What if there was a vampire who deserved to die? What if we could find one of the creatures you told me about, the ones who kill innocents for pleasure? Would it still be wrong to use the ritual then? Father Dmitri watched them both with sad, knowing eyes. You're speaking of justice, but the ritual doesn't work with unwilling sacrifices. The vampire who dies must choose to give their essence freely, must want to save the one being transformed. It's a gift of love, not a punishment for crimes. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Thomas felt his mind racing, trying to find solutions where none existed, trying to see a path forward that didn't end in death or separation. Finally he spoke, and the words came from somewhere deep and certain, a place he didn't fully understand but trusted completely. Then I'll do it, he said quietly. Make me a vampire, Ilara. Create the bond between us, like Nikolai created it with you. Then when he comes, when Nikolai tries to take you back, I'll offer myself for the ritual. I'll die so you can be human again, so you can be free. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Ilara stared at him like he'd lost his mind, and Father Dimitri's face had gone pale. Thomas, no, Ilara said, her voice breaking. You don't know what you're offering. You don't understand what it means to be what I am. Thomas took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. I understand that I love you, he said simply. I understand that these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I understand that my old life is gone, that I can never go back to being Lord Whitmore's son, that I'm already dead to the world I knew. At least this way, my death would mean something. At least this way you would be free. You're insane, Ilara breathed. But Thomas could see the hope kindling in her golden eyes. The desperate, terrible hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the trap that had held her for 2 centuries. Maybe I am, but I'm offering anyway. Turn me, Ilara, make me like you. Then teach me everything you know in whatever time we have before Nikolai arrives. And when he comes, we'll perform the ritual. You'll be human. You'll be free. And I'll finally do something that matters with this worthless life I've been running from. Father Dmitri stood slowly, his expression grave. If you do this, he said, there's no going back. The transformation is permanent. And even if the ritual succeeds, even if Ilara becomes human, you'll still be dead, Thomas. Your soul will move on to whatever comes after. Are you truly prepared to make that sacrifice for someone you've known less than a month? Thomas didn't hesitate. Yes. Ilara was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, and Thomas knew she was torn between hope and horror. I can't ask this of you, she whispered. It's too much. It's everything. You're not asking, Thomas said gently. I'm offering. There's a difference. He pulled her into his arms, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become untethered. Let me do this, Ilara. Let me give you what Mikhail took away. Let me give you the choice to be human again, to live in sunlight, to age and grow old, and eventually die a natural death. Let me give you freedom, even if it costs me everything. They stood like that for a long time, 2 souls intertwined, making the kind of impossible choice that love sometimes demands. Finally, Ilara pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held centuries of pain and days of hope. If we do this, she said, if I turn you and we perform the ritual, I need you to understand something. When you die to make me human, I'll remember you every day of my mortal life. Every sunrise I see will be because you gave up yours. Every breath I take will be borrowed from you. I'll live with that burden, that beautiful, terrible burden, until the day I die. Are you willing to give me that along with your life? Thomas smiled and kissed her forehead. I'm willing to give you everything, he said simply. Father Dmitri cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. If you're serious about this, we'll need to prepare. The ritual requires specific ingredients and conditions, and the transformation itself takes 3 days. Thomas will need to die and be reborn as a vampire, and that process is neither quick nor painless. Meanwhile, Nikolai draws closer with every passing hour. We have perhaps a week, maybe less, before he arrives. Are you certain you want to proceed? Thomas and Ilara looked at each other, and in that moment, they both knew there was no other path. This was their choice, their sacrifice, their last desperate attempt at salvation. We're certain, they said together. The next days passed in a blur of preparation and transformation. Father Dmitri, it turned out, knew more about vampire lore than any priest had a right to know. He'd spent decades studying the supernatural after helping Mikhail imprison Ilara, driven by guilt to understand the creatures he'd helped condemn. He had books and notes hidden in his pack, ancient texts that described the ritual in painful detail. Meanwhile, Ilara began the process of turning Thomas, and he learned firsthand why she'd called it excruciating. She fed from him first, drinking deeply until he was on the edge of consciousness. Then she bit her own wrist and held it to his mouth, making him drink her ancient blood. The taste was like metal and flowers and darkness all at once. It burned going down, and Thomas felt it spreading through, his veins like liquid fire. For 3 days, he lay in agony while his body died and remade itself. His heart slowed and eventually stopped. His breathing became shallow and then ceased entirely. His human senses faded and were replaced by something sharper, stranger, more intense. And through it all, Ilara stayed by his side, holding his hand, whispering encouragement, promising him that the pain would end and something new would begin. When Thomas finally opened his eyes as a vampire, the world had transformed. He could hear Father Dimitri's heartbeat from across the cabin. He could smell blood and fear and hope and desperation. He could see in perfect detail, even though night had fallen. And he could feel Ilara, a connection that thrummed in his chest like a second heartbeat, the bond she'd created by turning him. He understood now why Nikolai had forged such a connection. To feel another person's presence constantly, to know they existed and where they were at all times. It was intoxicating and terrible. "How do you feel?" Ilara asked, her voice full of concern and something that might have been regret. Thomas sat up slowly, testing his new body, feeling the supernatural strength in muscles that no longer needed oxygen or rest. "Different," he said. "Like myself, but more. Is this how you always feel?" "Yes," Ilara said softly. "Welcome to immortality, Thomas Whitmore. I'm sorry I had to give it to you, and I'm sorry I'll have to take it away so soon." Thomas reached for her hand, marveling at how he could now feel the coolness of her skin without discomfort, how they were finally the same temperature. "Don't be sorry," he said. "This is my choice. This is what I want." Father Dmitri approached, carrying an ancient book bound in leather that might have been human skin. "The ritual can be performed at dawn," he said. "That's when the barrier between life and death is thinnest, when transformation is most possible. We'll need to act quickly. I can feel him coming, feel the pressure of his presence. Nikolai will be here by tomorrow night at the latest. If we're going to do this, it must be at tomorrow's dawn." That night, their last night together, Thomas and Ilara sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. They talked about the life Ilara would live after the ritual, how she would find a village and start over as a human woman. They talked about what Thomas hoped his death would mean, that maybe his sacrifice would balance some karmic scale, would make up for his father's sins by saving a life instead of destroying one. They talked about the weeks they'd shared in the cabin, how those brief days had meant more than all the years that came before. And finally, as dawn approached and Father Dmitri began preparing the ritual space, they talked about love. "I love you," Thomas said simply, because there was no time left for eloquence or hesitation. "I've loved you since that night you cried over the deer. Maybe before. I know it's fast, I know it's impossible, but it's true. And I need you to know that before I die, I need you to know that this isn't sacrifice. This is gift. You've given me more in these few weeks than I found in 32 years of living. You've shown me what it means to fight your nature, to choose goodness even when darkness is easier. You've made me better than I was. So thank you, Ilara. Thank you for seeing me." Thank you for saving me. Thank you for letting me save you in return." Ilara was crying, tears she could still shed as a vampire, but wouldn't be able to shed as a human. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you since you offered me your blood that first night. Since you trusted me when you had no reason to trust. Since you looked at me and saw a person instead of a monster. Thomas, I'll carry you with me forever. Every moment of my human life will be lived in your honor. I'll marry someday if I can bear to, and I'll have children and grandchildren, and I'll tell them about the man who gave me the world. I'll make your sacrifice mean something. I promise you that." They held each other as the sun began to rise, and Father Dmitri called them to the ritual space he'd prepared. The ritual itself was complex, requiring Thomas to give his entire essence, his vampiric power and life force, to fuel Ilara's transformation. It would hurt, Father Dmitri warned. It would feel like being torn apart from the inside. But it would be over quickly, and at the end, Thomas would simply stop existing. No afterlife was guaranteed for vampires who died this way. His soul might move on, or it might simply dissipate like smoke. There was no way to know. Thomas knelt in the circle Father Dmitri had drawn, and Ilara knelt across from him. The priest began chanting in a language older than Latin, and Thomas felt power gathering in the air like a storm. Ilara reached out and took both his hands, and their eyes met one final time. "I'll remember you," she said. "Always," Thomas smiled. "That's all I ask." The power released, and Thomas felt his essence being pulled from his body, flowing into Ilara through their clasped hands. It hurt worse than anything he'd ever experienced, worse than the transformation, worse than any physical pain. It felt like his soul was being shredded, piece by piece, and fed into the alchemy that would remake Ilara into a human. But through the pain, he watched her change. Her golden eyes faded to brown, her pale skin flushed with warmth and color. Her supernatural stillness gave way to the small movements of living, breathing that wasn't conscious choice, a heartbeat that was stuttering back to life. The warmth of blood flowing through mortal veins. She was beautiful. She was alive. She was free. And Thomas was fading, his consciousness dissolving like morning mist. His last thought wasn't of pain or fear, but of gratitude. He'd been running from his father's sins, but at the end, he'd created something good. He'd saved someone worth saving. His life, worthless as he'd thought it was, had meant something. Ilara screamed as Thomas's body collapsed, his essence fully transferred, and she was suddenly completely human. She could feel the sun on her skin without burning. She could feel hunger for food and thirst for water. She could feel tired in a way vampires never did. And she could feel the gaping hole where the bond to Nikolai had been, severed by her transformation. She was free. But the cost of that freedom lay crumpled in the ritual circle, and Ilara threw herself on Thomas's body and sobbed like her heart was breaking. Because it was. Father Dmitri knelt beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's gone, child," the priest said softly. "His sacrifice is complete. You must honor it by living well." But Ilara couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop holding Thomas's cold body, couldn't process the impossible reality that he was gone and she was alive and human and free. She stayed like that for hours, until Father Dmitri finally pulled her away and helped her bury Thomas's body behind the cabin, under the snow and the pines. They marked the grave with a simple wooden cross, and Ilara knelt beside it and made a promise. "I'll live," she said through her tears. "I'll live the most beautiful, full, meaningful life I can. I'll see sunrises and fall in love and have children and grow old. I'll do all the things you gave me the chance to do. And when I finally die, decades from now, I'll find you. Wherever souls go, whatever comes after, I'll find you, Thomas Whitmore. And I'll thank you again for setting me free." That night Nikolai arrived at the cabin, drawn by the bond that no longer existed. He found Ilara sitting by the fire, human and mortal, and beyond his reach. The ancient vampire raged and threatened and begged, but there was nothing he could do. The bond was broken. Ilara was no longer his. Finally he left, disappearing into the darkness, and Ilara never saw him again. She stayed in the cabin through the winter, and Father Dmitri stayed with her, teaching her how to be human again, how to navigate the world she'd left behind 2 centuries ago. In the spring, they traveled together to a village where Ilara started over with a new name and a new life. She married eventually, a kind farmer who never learned about her past. She had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. She lived to be 87 years old, and every single day of those human years, she thought of Thomas. She told his story to her grandchildren when she was old and grey, sitting by her own fireplace in a house far from the Carpathian Mountains. She told them about a man who ran from his father's sins and found his salvation by saving someone else. She told them about sacrifice and love and the choice to be better than your circumstances. And when she died peacefully in her sleep at the end of a long and beautiful life, her last words were, "I'm coming, Thomas. Wait for me. I'm coming home." Some said she smiled as she took her last breath. Some said she looked young again, like the girl she'd been before Nikolai turned her. And some said that if you listened carefully, you could hear 2 voices laughing together in the distance, finally reunited after decades of separation. The cabin still stands in the Carpathian Mountains. People avoid it, saying it's haunted by the ghost of a vampire and the man who loved her enough to die. But sometimes, travelers seeking shelter from storms find the door unlocked and a fire burning in the hearth, as if someone is still keeping watch, still offering refuge to those who are running from their pasts. And if you're lucky, if you're broken enough and brave enough and desperate enough, you might hear a whisper on the wind, a voice that sounds like love and sacrifice and hope. You're not your father's sins. You're not your family's past. You're the choice you make right now, in this moment, to be something better. Choose love. Choose sacrifice. Choose to save someone when you have the chance. That's how you become more than what you were born into. That's how you find your way home.